There is a famous passage in the Varieties of Religious Experience in which William James describes the experience of a French correspondent, a man who, entering a room one evening, was suddenly overcome by a terrifying vision. He saw, as clearly as if it were physically present, a patient in an asylum he had once visited, an epileptic youth with greenish skin who sat all day on a bench, moving nothing but his dark eyes. The correspondent was suddenly seized with the certainty, that shape is me. Nothing prevents me from being reduced to that. And with this realization, everything that had seemed solid and safe in his life was transformed into threat. The darkness behind the pleasant surfaces of the world opened, and he fell into it. James was writing, most scholars believe, about himself. This passage introduces what James called the sick soul, a psychological type whose experience of the world is shadowed by an awareness of its suffering, impermanence, and potential meaninglessness that cannot be argued away or distracted from. The sick soul is not neurotic in the dismissive sense. They are, James thought, actually more perceptive than the easily contented healthy-minded person. They see something real that the optimist is managing not to see. James described two varieties of the sick soul suffering. The first is the passive kind, a loss of positive feeling, a draining away of the natural joy that makes ordinary life self-evidently worth living. Things that once seemed inherently valuable no longer seem so. Food still provides nutrition but not pleasure. Relationships still function but feel hollow. The person continues going through the motions of life while the inner warmth that made the motions feel worthwhile has quietly extinguished. James observed this condition, which modern psychiatry calls anhedonia, with great precision. He noted that it often strikes people of natural vitality particularly hard, because the gap between remembered richness and present blankness is especially stark. The second, more acute variety is active despair, not merely the absence of positive feeling but the presence of dread. The world feels actively threatening. Existence itself seems ominous. The future contains nothing that can be trusted. The person lives, as James put it, in a sort of hell, not because anything has concretely gone wrong but because the veil of positive illusion that normally protects us from direct contact with the existential situation has been stripped away. James traced the sick soul's predicament to an inability to sustain what he called healthy-minded positivity, the natural capacity to focus on the pleasant and ignore or minimize the painful. The sick soul cannot do this. Their attention is drawn magnetically toward what is wrong, toward the inevitability of suffering and death, toward the absence of any ultimate guarantee that any of it means anything. This is not chosen. It is constitutional. And while it is painful, James insisted it was not simply wrong. The healthy-minded person achieves their contentment partly through selective attention. They look away from what is dark. The sick soul is incapable of this looking away, and in their forced engagement with the full picture of existence, they develop a form of psychological depth and realism that the healthy-minded person, in their comfortable contentment, cannot access. The sick soul is not simply damaged. They are, in a specific sense, more truthful. But James did not leave the sick soul in the darkness. He described what he called the twice-born personality, the person who has passed through the sick soul experience and arrived on the far side of it, not by avoiding the darkness but by integrating it. The twice-born person has faced the worst that existence can show them, the suffering, the impermanence, the meaninglessness, and found that they can survive it and even, in some cases, that surviving it has produced a depth of being that merely comfortable lives do not achieve. The path through, James observed, typically involves some form of surrender, a release of the frantic attempt to solve the existential problem through will or intellect, and an opening to some resource or reality larger than the beleaguered itself. For many of the people he studied, this took explicitly religious form. For others, it was more psychological, a shift from the perspective of the isolated self-grasping for certainty to something like acceptance of the unfinishable uncertainty of existence. Modern psychology recognizes in James's description a blend of what we would call major depression, existential anxiety, and the particular variety of suffering that arises when a person's implicit assumptions about the world, its safety, its meaningfulness, its benevolence, are suddenly shattered. We also recognize the twice-born pattern in what researchers now call post-traumatic growth, the genuine positive transformation that some people report following severe adversity. James was describing this process before the vocabulary for it existed. For anyone in the grip of the sick soul experience, James's analysis offers both validation and direction. The darkness you are experiencing is not proof that you are broken. It may be the most honest thing that has ever happened to you. And if you can stay with it without turning away and without collapsing, you may discover, as James did, that there is something on the other side of it worth the passage. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.